The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic drone, a sound that promised ruin. But the 75 ducks shivering in the bent wire cage promised something else, something nobody else in the dusty crowd could hear. Elara Vance heard it. It was a whisper of hope so faint, it felt more like a memory. That was why, when the auctioneer finally turned to the cage, a forgotten lot at the back of the farm liquidation sale, she raised her hand. He didn't even see her at first, his gaze sweeping over the grim-faced men in dusty hats, men who were there to pick over the bones of a failed farm, not to buy half-dead poultry. "All right, what am I bid for this lot of ducks? As is, where is?" he chanted, his tone laced with dismissal. Frost got to him a bit. "Let's start at $50. $50 for the lot." Silence. The wind kicked up a swirl of red dust that settled on the cage, on the men's shoulders, on Elara's worn boots. $50 was a week's worth of scarce groceries. Nobody was buying liabilities. 40, 30, come on, folks, somebody take 'em off my hands. $20. The auctioneer was getting annoyed. He wanted to get to the tractors, the real money. That's when Silas Croft laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, but it was sharp and serrated, cutting through the heavy air. He stood near the front, his new leather boots immune to the dust, his silver belt buckle gleaming. He was buying land, not livestock. He was buying futures, not feelings. He turned his head slowly, his eyes finding Elara where she stood at the edge of the crowd. $22, Elara said, her voice quiet but clear. It was all the cash she had in her pocket. It was meant for a new water pump filter, a filter that was probably useless anyway, given how low her well was. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with relief. $22 from the lady in the back. Going once, going twice. He didn't wait for a third call. Sold. To the lady for $22. A few men shuffled their feet. Someone coughed out a dry chuckle. But it was Silas Croft's voice that sealed the moment in public shame. He stepped forward, not addressing her directly, but speaking to the crowd, to the sky, to the dying land itself. "Well, that explains why the Vance farm is turning to dust," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "You can't water a dead field with tears and sentiment, Elara." His words hung in the air, an epitaph for her family's legacy. The other farmers, men she'd known her whole life, wouldn't meet her eyes. They saw what Silas saw, a foolish woman making a foolish choice, clinging to sentiment while the world burned down around her. They saw a farm that was already a corpse, and a woman feeding it more mouths instead of calling the undertaker. Elara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, but she forced it down, turning it into something cold and hard in the pit of her stomach. She did not look at Silas. She did not defend herself. She walked to the auctioneer's table, smoothed out the crumpled bills, a 10, a 5, and 7 ones, and paid her $22. She took the receipt without a word and went to claim her purchase. The ducks huddled together, a miserable clump of matted feathers and shivering bodies. They looked as broken as she felt. But as she carried the heavy cage toward her old rattling truck, she knew this wasn't an ending. This was a beginning. Silas Croft, with all his money and all his land, had just made a terrible mistake. He had underestimated her, and he had no idea what the ducks knew. The drive home was a study in brown. The fields on either side of the road were cracked and barren, the corn stalks brittle skeletons rattling in the wind. The drought had been a slow thief, stealing the green from the valley inch by inch over 2 relentless years. It had stolen the hope from the faces of her neighbors and the weight from their cattle. Now it was coming for her land, the 150 acres her grandfather had bought with sweat and foresight. Silas Croft was just the vulture circling what the drought was killing. Her own farm looked no better. The welcome sign, hand-painted by her grandmother decades ago, listed to one side, its cheerful blue letters faded to a ghostly gray. Vance Homestead, established 1948. It felt like a gravestone. She parked the truck by the barn, the engine sputtering to a stop with a grateful sigh. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rustle of the wind through the dead leaves of the cottonwood tree. Inside the cage, the ducks were quiet, too weak to even quack. She unlatched the wire door carefully. One by one, she lifted them out. Their bodies were light, their feet cold as ice. Frostbite had blackened the tips of their bills and the webbing between their toes. She carried them into the warmest part of the barn, a corner stall filled with old clean straw. She filled a low trough with water from the rain barrel, the last of it, and another with the last of her chicken feed, mixed with some precious oats. They drank first, a desperate, clumsy thirst. They ignored the food. Water was life. It was the only thing that mattered. Elara sat on an overturned bucket and watched them, her heart a tight knot in her chest. $22. It felt like both a pittance and a fortune. It was the price of a foolish hope. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, a low, rumbling sound like stones shifting in a riverbed. The land talks, Ellie. You just have to learn its language. The animals know it better than we do. They don't have maps, but they always know where to find water. She had heard him say it 100 times as they walked the property, his big, calloused hand holding hers. He would stop and point to a line of ants, the direction a hawk was circling, the type of moss growing on a rock. To him, it was all communication. To a young Elara, it was just stories. Now it was all she had left. That night, she didn't sleep in the house. She brought a blanket and a pillow out to the barn, sleeping in the hayloft where she could hear the soft rustling of the ducks below. She needed to feel the life she had just bought, a fragile counterpoint to the death pressing in on all sides. As she drifted off, she thought of Silas Croft's smirk, the pity in her neighbor's eyes. Let them think she was a fool with 75 chances. In the morning, 3 of the ducks were dead. She buried them under the old cottonwood, her throat tight. She'd known she would lose some. It didn't make it easier. The remaining 72 were stronger, though. They were preening, their movements less stiff. A few even managed a hoarse, tentative quack. They were survivors, just like her. She spent the day reinforcing an old chicken run near the barn, making it safe for them. The ground inside the run was as hard as concrete. She had to use a pickaxe to break it up enough to install the fence posts. Every swing of the heavy tool was a grunt of defiance against Silas, against the drought, against the whispers in town. Sentiment, tears, a dead field. The words fueled her. When the enclosure was ready, she herded the ducks inside. They waddled uncertainly onto the parched earth, their damaged feet tender on the rough ground. They clustered around the water trough, their only source of comfort. Elara watched them for hours. They did nothing interesting. They just huddled, drank, and occasionally pecked at the feed. She felt a flicker of doubt. Was this just a desperate fantasy? Had she wasted her last dollars on a flock of dying birds and a dead man's folk tale? That evening, she went into her grandfather's study. It was the one room in the house she had kept exactly as he'd left it. His roll-top desk was dusty. His books on soil science and animal husbandry lined the shelves. It smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and earth. It was the smell of safety. of a time when the land was generous and the future felt secure. She ran her fingers over the spines of the books before pulling out the one she was looking for, a thick, leather-bound ledger. It wasn't a financial record. It was his journal, decades of observations written in his strong, slanted hand. She opened it to a random page. June 1978. The cicadas are loud this year. Means a dry August. Told young Miller to expect it, but he just laughed. He's putting in cotton. Fool. She flipped through the pages, a chronicle of a life spent listening to the land. He wrote about the migration patterns of geese, the depth of the frost, the color of the evening sky. And he wrote about water. He was obsessed with it. He documented every flood, every dry spell, the levels of the creek, the output of the well. Tucked into the back of the journal was what she was really looking for. It was a map. Not a surveyor's map, but one he had drawn himself on a large piece of yellowed parchment. It showed the 150 acres of the Vance homestead in meticulous detail. Every hill, every gully, every ancient oak was marked. But there were other markings, too. Strange symbols and notes in the margins, written in a code only she might understand. Her eyes traced the faint blue line of the creek bed, which he had labeled Sleeping Snake. It had been dry for over a year now, just a scar of cracked mud and bleached stones. Near the northern edge of the property, where the creek took a sharp bend around a cluster of granite boulders, he had drawn a small, strange symbol, a circle with a series of wavy lines radiating from it. Beside it, he had written a single cryptic phrase, "The web feet know the way." She had seen it 100 times before. As a child, she thought it was a doodle, a little sun with wiggly rays. As a young woman, she thought it was a folksy saying, one of his many riddles. But now, sitting in the dusty silence with the weight of the farm on her shoulders and 72 frostbitten ducks in her barn, the words felt different. They felt like an instruction. The map was the proof object, the key. Her grandfather had left her a treasure map, but the treasure wasn't gold. It was water, and the key to unlocking it was apparently waddling around in her new enclosure. A week passed. Then, 2. Elara fell into a routine. She would wake before dawn, tend to the ducks, and then spend hours on the futile tasks of a dying farm, patching fences that held nothing in, clearing irrigation ditches that carried nothing but dust. She was putting on a show. For Silas. For everyone. She needed them to believe she was beaten. She sold her grandfather's old broken-down plow for scrap metal. She sold a few head of her scrawny cattle to a trader for a fraction of their worth. The whispers in town grew louder. Poor Elara, holding on too long. Pride. Ben Carter, a retired county extension agent and one of her grandfather's oldest friends, stopped by one afternoon. He was a kind man with watery blue eyes and a face as wrinkled as a dried apple. He didn't offer pity. He just looked at her parched fields and shook his head. "It's a bad one, Ellie," he said, leaning against the fence of the duck enclosure. "Worst I've seen since '88. "Worse than that," she said quietly. He watched the ducks, which were now looking much healthier. Their feathers had a sheen to them, and they moved with more confidence. "Heard you bought these at the auction. Silas Croft was having a good laugh about it at the diner." Elara's jaw tightened. "Silas Croft can laugh all he wants. He won't be laughing for long." Ben looked at her, his expression shifting from sympathy to curiosity. "What do you know that he doesn't?" She hesitated. Trust was a currency as scarce as water these days. But Ben had been loyal to her grandfather. He was one of the few who had respected the old man's ways. She made a decision. She invited him into the house, into the sacred space of the study, and showed him the map. He squinted at the drawing, his finger tracing the line of the sleeping snake. He read the note in the margin. "The web feet know the way," he murmured, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Of course. Your grandfather always said that. He believed there was an artesian spring somewhere on this property, sealed up by a layer of clay. He said a real drought, the kind that dries up the surface water for miles, would be the only thing to make the animals desperate enough to find it again. An artesian spring, a self-pressurizing underground well, independent of the water table that everyone else's wells relied on. A source of water that the drought couldn't touch. It was a geological miracle, a legend." "But how do the ducks find it?" Elara asked, the hope in her chest so sharp it was painful. "He believed they can sense the pressure, the moisture deep in the earth," Ben explained. "Instinct. They're drawn to it, but they won't look for it as long as there's easier water available." "You've been keeping them in that enclosure, right?" "With a trough." She nodded. "It's time to let them out, Ellie," he said, his eyes gleaming. "Let them get thirsty. Truly thirsty. And then you follow them." The next morning, she did it. She filled their trough for the last time. She watched them drink their fill. Then, with her heart pounding, she opened the gate of the enclosure and stood back. The ducks hesitated, unused to freedom. Then one brave soul, a big drake with a bright green head, waddled out. The others followed, a clumsy, quacking procession. They didn't go far at first. They explored the dusty farmyard, pecking at bits of nothing. They stayed close to the barn, their known world. Elara watched from the porch, her grandfather's map clutched in her hand. The sun beat down, hot and merciless. Hours passed. The ducks grew restless. They began to wander further, their quacks taking on an anxious, questioning tone. They were looking for water. That afternoon, Ben came back. He wasn't alone. He had brought 2 large, official-looking canisters and a device that looked like a complicated metal detector. "Water testing kit and a soil resistivity meter," he explained. "If they find something, we'll need proof." He also brought information. He had been making some quiet inquiries at the county water board. "Something's not right, Ellie. The water table is dropping faster than the drought models predict, especially in this part of the valley. It's almost like something is sucking it dry from the bottom." His eyes met hers, and she knew they were thinking the same thing. Silas Croft. His own farm, miles away, was suspiciously green. He claimed it was due to efficient water management, but the rumors were he had drilled a new, impossibly deep well last year. A well that went far below the permitted depth, tapping into the ancient aquifer that fed the whole region. "He's not just surviving the drought," Elara said, the cold hardness returning to her stomach. "He's causing it, or making it worse. He's bleeding us all dry so he can buy our land for nothing." "It's what I think," Ben said grimly. "But proving it is another story. The water board is slow and Croft has deep pockets and powerful friends. Right now, our best hope is right there." He nodded toward the flock of ducks, which was now moving with a strange sense of purpose, heading away from the farmyard and toward the open, desiccated pasture. They were heading north, toward the sleeping snake. Elara and Ben followed at a distance, their boots kicking up puffs of fine, talcum-like dust. The sun was relentless. The air was still and hot. The only sounds were the crunch of their footsteps and the increasingly insistent quacking of the ducks. The flock moved as one, no longer wandering but marching. They were following the drake with the green head, who seemed to know exactly where he was going. They reached the dry creek bed. The ducks didn't hesitate. They scrambled down the crumbling bank and onto the cracked, sun-baked mud of the creek floor. They walked along the bed, following its curves. Elara checked her grandfather's map. They were following the line of the sleeping snake perfectly. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was happening. It was real. They came to the bend in the creek, the spot marked on the map with the strange sun-like symbol. A cluster of huge granite boulders, bleached white by the sun, stood like ancient sentinels. The ground here was different. It was still dry, but the mud had cracked into a finer, web-like pattern. There were even a few skeletal remains of old cattails, proof that this spot held water longer than the rest of the creek. The ducks converged on this spot. They stopped their frantic marching and began to mill about, their quacks growing louder, more excited. They lowered their heads, pecking at the ground, not for food but with a strange rhythmic intensity. The big drake was the most determined. He used his bill like a shovel, scraping at the hard-packed clay. Elara and Ben approached slowly, not wanting to scare them. The air felt charged, electric with possibility. The ducks were digging. They were paddling their feet, their webbed toes scratching at the surface. It was a frenzy of instinct. "Look," Ben whispered, pointing. Where the drake was digging, a dark patch was forming, a tiny circle of moisture seeping up from below. The ground was sweating. The other ducks saw it and redoubled their efforts, all of them pecking and scratching at that one specific spot. The dark patch grew wider. The clay became mud. The mud became a puddle. And then, with a soft gurgle, a tiny fountain of water bubbled up from the earth. It was no bigger than a thumb, but it was clear and cold and real. The ducks went wild, plunging their bills into the water, drinking and splashing, their joyous quacks echoing off the granite boulders. Elara dropped to her knees. She touched the water with her fingertips. It was cold, pure. She laughed, a sound that was half a sob. It was real. Her grandfather was right. The webfeet knew the way. Ben was already at work with his equipment. He took a sample of the water. He used the resistivity meter, pushing its probes into the ground around the new spring. He whistled, low and long. "Ellie, you're not going to believe this. The pressure is immense. This isn't a seep. It's the real deal. A major artesian aquifer. There's a river of water under our feet." They had found it. But finding it was only the first step. Now, she had to wield it. This water wasn't just her salvation. It was her weapon. The next 2 weeks were a blur of secret activity. Ben helped her file the necessary paperwork with the State Water Commission, staking her claim to the newly discovered spring. They did it quietly, electronically, burying it in a mountain of bureaucratic filings. They needed time before Silas Croft got wind of it. A geologist from the state, a friend of Ben's, came out for a discreet survey. His report confirmed it. The Vance Spring, as they were now calling it, was one of the most significant artesian sources in the region, capable of producing thousands of gallons a minute without impacting the depleted regional aquifer. It was a geological lottery ticket. Meanwhile, Elara played the part of the beaten farmer to perfection. She let the weeds grow. She kept the ducks hidden in the barn, telling inquiring neighbors that they had mostly died off or been taken by coyotes. She looked tired and drawn whenever she went into town for supplies. The story of her impending failure was solidifying into accepted fact. The final provocation came exactly as she knew it would. Silas Croft's gleaming black truck rolled up her driveway, spitting gravel. He got out, looking smug and magnanimous, a file folder in his hand. He found her on the porch, staring out at her brown fields. "Elara," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "I came to see how you were holding up." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of his victory. "I'm managing," she said, her voice flat. He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. We both know that's not true. Look at this place. It's finished. I'm here to do you a favor." He opened the folder. It was a purchase offer. The price was an insult. Barely 10 cents on the dollar for what the land was worth, even in a drought. "This is my final offer," he said, tapping the paper with a manicured finger. "It's more than fair for a property with a dry well and no prospects. Sign it by the end of the week. After that, the price goes down. There's no point in dragging this out." He looked out at the dead fields, the crumbling barn. "See? A farm can't run on sentiment. It's time to let go." He had repeated the line, the callback. He thought he was driving the final nail into her coffin. He had no idea he was stepping into a trap she'd been setting for weeks. "I'll think about it, Silas," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. He chuckled, confident. "You'd do that." He got back in his truck and drove away, leaving a cloud of triumphant dust behind him. She watched him go, a cold, calm fury settling over her. The end of the week. That was his deadline. It was also the date of the emergency town hall meeting on the drought, a meeting where Silas Croft was the keynote speaker. It was perfect. The town hall was packed. Every farmer in the valley was there, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. They sat on folding chairs in the stuffy, fluorescent-lit room. The air was thick with desperation. Silas Croft sat at the front table with the mayor and the county supervisor, looking polished and authoritative. He was their reluctant savior. Elara slipped into a seat at the back, unnoticed. Ben gave her a subtle nod from across the room. The state water commissioner, a stern-looking woman named Ms. Albright, was seated in the front row, ostensibly as an observer. No one knew Elara had invited her. The meeting began with grim reports. Well levels were at historic lows. The forecast was for another 3 months with no rain. The mood in the room grew heavier with each presentation. Finally, the mayor introduced Silas Croft to discuss some potential community-based solutions. Silas stood up and walked to the podium, the picture of success and reason. He spoke about consolidation, about efficiency, about the hard choices that had to be made. He painted a picture of a future where smaller, less viable farms would be absorbed into larger, more technologically advanced operations, like his. He was offering to buy their land, he said, not as a predator, but as a lifeline. "We're all in this together," he concluded, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "We have to be realistic. We can't let sentiment get in the way of survival." There was a smattering of reluctant applause. He had laid the groundwork. He was the only one with a plan, the only one with green fields. Then the floor was opened for public comment. A few farmers stood up to ask desperate questions about government aid or water rationing. Then Elara stood up. A murmur went through the crowd. What was she doing here? Hadn't she already given up? She walked to the microphone at the side of the room. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the hall. "My name is Elara Vance," she said. "My family has farmed in this valley for over 70 years, and I'm not here tonight to talk about sentiment. I'm here to talk about the water." Silas Croft watched her from the front table, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He thought she was going to make some emotional, rambling plea. "We've all been told the drought is the enemy," she continued, "that it's an act of God we are all suffering through equally. But that's not true. We are not all suffering equally. And the drought isn't our only enemy." She paused, letting the words sink in. She had their attention now. "The regional water table is dropping faster than it should. It's dropping because it's being drained illegally by a well drilled hundreds of feet deeper than the legal limit. a well that is stealing water from every single one of us. An angry muttering started in the crowd. Silas Croft stood up, his face darkening. These are baseless accusations. This is the rambling of a desperate woman who couldn't manage her own farm and is looking for someone to blame, he boomed, trying to seize control of the narrative. You have no proof. Elara looked directly at him. The moment had come. The entire room was silent, watching them. You're right about one thing, Silas, she said, her voice dropping to a steely quiet. You told me you can't water a field with sentiment. You have to water it with water. She let the phrase hang in the air. His own words turned back on him. The water you've been stealing from all of us. She didn't need to present the evidence herself. She turned her gaze to the front row. Commissioner Albright? Ms. Albright, the neutral authority, stood up. Her voice was crisp and official. The State Water Commission received evidence of anomalous water usage in this valley several weeks ago. We cross-referenced satellite imagery of agricultural irrigation with registered well-pumping logs. She looked directly at Silas Croft, whose face had gone from red to a pasty white. An investigation into Mr. Croft's water usage is now active. As of this afternoon, his wells have been capped and his pumping equipment has been impounded pending a full audit. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was heavier than any shout, more damning than any accusation. It was the sound of a king being dethroned. The farmers stared, their faces a mixture of shock, dawning comprehension, and slow-burning rage. The man who had positioned himself as their savior was the architect of their ruin. They looked at his green fields, their own brown ones, and they finally understood the obscene discrepancy. Silas Croft sputtered, his composure shattering. This is a lie, a conspiracy. She put her up to this. He pointed a trembling finger at Elara, but no one was listening to him anymore. They were all looking at Elara, who hadn't raised her voice once. But there is good news, Elara said into the profound silence. The drought may have taken our surface water, but it has revealed something new. Or something old, that was forgotten. She held up a copy of her grandfather's hand-drawn map. My grandfather always knew there was another source of water on our land, an artesian spring, sealed deep underground. He said the right animals could find it if they were desperate enough. She told them the story about the auction, the $22, the 72 frostbitten ducks. She told them how the ducks, driven by instinct, had led her to the spot on the dry creek bed, how they had dug and scratched until water bubbled up from the ground. A few people in the crowd looked skeptical, but most were listening with rapt attention. It sounded like a fairy tale, but after the bombshell about Silas, they were ready to believe in anything. Commissioner Albright's office has surveyed the spring, Elara concluded. It's real, and it's significant. It's enough water, if managed properly, to help this community, to help us survive. This time, the silence was broken by a sound. One farmer in the back started to clap, then another. Soon, the entire room, minus Silas and the stunned mayor, was on its feet, applauding. It wasn't just for the water. It was for her. For the quiet, underestimated woman who had trusted a flock of broken ducks and an old man's wisdom over the cynical logic of a powerful man. Silas Croft stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Then, as two sheriff's deputies began to walk toward the front table, he turned and fled out a side door. It didn't matter. There was nowhere for him to run. His empire, built on stolen water, had just crumbled into dust. In the immediate aftermath, things moved quickly. The story of the town hall meeting spread like wildfire. Silas Croft was officially charged with felony water theft, fraud, and a dozen other environmental violations. His assets were frozen. The community that had once looked to him as a leader now saw him as a pariah. Elara, overnight, became a local hero. The Vance Spring was the talk of the state. Engineers and hydrologists arrived to help her develop it responsibly. They installed a powerful pump, and soon clear, life-giving water was flowing into a newly constructed reservoir. The sound of it, a constant, gentle rush, was the most beautiful music Elara had ever heard. She didn't hoard the water. That would have made her no better than Silas, working with Ben and a newly formed water cooperative of local farmers. She established a system for sharing the resource. The water was piped to neighboring farms, reviving fields that had been given up for dead. For the first time in 2 years, the valley began to turn green again. The farmers who had once pitied or quietly mocked her now came to her with gratitude and respect in their eyes. They offered to help on her farm, to share equipment, to give advice. They treated her not as a foolish woman, but as a leader. She had saved them. One afternoon, she found a letter in her mailbox. It was old. The envelope yellowed with age. It was her grandfather's handwriting. On the front, he had written, "For Ellie, to be opened when the sleeping snake wakes up." A friend he had entrusted it to had mailed it after hearing the news. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was short. "My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, it means the land has given up its deepest secret, and you were wise enough to listen. I'm sorry I am not there to see it. Remember this, the water is a gift, not a possession. Share it. The land provides for those who care for it, not for those who seek only to own it. You have a good heart. You were always the best part of this farm. I am so proud of you. Love, Grandpa." Tears streamed down her face as she read his final words. It was the validation she had craved, the final piece of her victory. He had known. He had trusted her all along. A few months later, there was another liquidation auction. This time it was for the assets of Silas Croft. His gleaming tractors, his high-tech equipment, his fleet of trucks, all of it was being sold off to pay his monumental fines and legal fees. Elara went. She stood at the back, just as she had before. When her grandfather's old plow, the one she'd sold for scrap, came up on the block, she bought it back for a fair price. She didn't gloat. She saw Silas's wife and son in the crowd, their faces pale and drawn. She felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of justice. He had earned this. This was the consequence of his greed. That small act of buying back the plow was her only indulgence, a quiet reclamation. It was a mercy to herself, not a cruelty to them. A year later, the valley was transformed. The drought hadn't broken. The rains were still scarce, but it no longer held the power of life and death over them. The Vance Spring, managed by the cooperative, was a steady, reliable source of life. Fields of alfalfa and corn grew lush and green under the hot sun. The cattle were fat again. Hope had returned. Elara's farm was the epicenter of this rebirth. The 150 acres that had been turning to dust were now a model of sustainable agriculture. She used a combination of modern drip irrigation, fed by the spring, and her grandfather's old wisdom about crop rotation and soil health. Her yields were higher than they had ever been. People came from all over the state to learn from her. The ducks, the descendants of the original 72, were the farm's mascots. They had a large, beautiful pond to swim in, created by the overflow from the spring. They were happy and fat, their quacks a constant, cheerful soundtrack to the farm's daily life. They were a living reminder that the most insignificant seeming creatures could hold the key to salvation. Her personal life had blossomed too. Daniel, the local veterinarian who had helped her nurse the first ducks back to health, had been a quiet supporter from the beginning. He had never seen her as foolish, only as compassionate. He had admired her grit, her quiet defiance. He had seen her strength when no one else did. Their friendship had slowly, naturally deepened into love. He was a kind, steady man who loved the land as much as she did. His presence in her life was as nourishing as the spring water. They often spent their evenings on the porch, watching the sun set over the greening valley. One evening, Daniel took her hand. "Do you ever think about that first auction?" he asked. Elara smiled. "Sometimes. I think about how scared I was, how alone I felt." "You were never alone," he said softly. "You had your grandfather's wisdom, and you had those ducks." She laughed. "I had those ducks." The news about Silas Croft came in snippets. He had avoided prison time by cooperating with a larger federal investigation into water rights fraud, but he was financially and socially annihilated. He lost all his land. The last anyone heard, he was working a menial job in a city hundreds of miles away, a bitter, broken man. His name was a cautionary tale in the valley, a synonym for greed and hubris. Elara never wasted a moment of her new life thinking about him. Her focus was on the future, on the soil between her fingers, on the water that flowed freely, on the man sitting beside her. She felt a profound sense of peace, a rightness that settled deep in her bones. She had faced ruin and had not backed down. She had trusted something older and deeper than money or power. She looked out at the pond where the ducks were paddling in the fading light, their webbed feet stirring the surface of the water that they had found. They were a simple, living truth. The world is full of secrets, and arrogance is blind to all of them. Greed is a language that the land does not speak. Her grandfather had been right. The deepest knowledge is not the widest. It is the kind that reaches the bottom of one true thing. She was living the life she had earned, a life watered not by tears, but by courage. And she knew, with a certainty that was as deep and clear as the spring itself, that it was a life she truly deserved.